I stood in the hallway outside his apartment for almost a full minute before knocking, listening to the faint hum of traffic through a cracked window somewhere above me. I wasn't angry yet. That surprised me. I thought I would be shaking, seeing red, imagining his face before I ever met him. Instead, my hands were steady. My heart wasn't racing. What I felt was colder than anger. I had rehearsed this moment 100 times over the last 3 weeks. What I would say, how he might react, how quickly things could spiral. I told myself I was here for answers, nothing more. One conversation, eye contact, closure. That was the lie I needed to believe to raise my hand and knock. The door opened almost immediately, like he'd been waiting on the other side. He was taller than I expected. Younger, too. Barefoot, relaxed, wearing a fitted t-shirt like this was just another ordinary night. He looked at me, then smiled. Not surprised, not confused. Amused. "You're early," he said. That was the moment my blood ran cold. For a second, I wondered if I had the wrong door. I checked the number behind me. No mistake. I looked back at him, searching his face for recognition, for guilt, for anything that suggested I was an unexpected problem. There was none. He stepped back slightly and opened the door wider, giving me space to enter, as if this had always been part of the evening's plan. "I think you know who I am," I said. He nodded. "Of course I do." No hesitation, no denial, just certainty. I didn't move. The hallway light behind me buzzed softly. Inside his apartment, I could see a clean living room, minimalist, expensive but impersonal. A place designed to impress without revealing anything real. He noticed my eyes scanning the space and chuckled quietly. "He hasn't been here tonight, if that's what you're worried about." "I didn't come to talk about schedules," I replied. "Sure you did," he said calmly. "You just don't know it yet." That was the second time something shifted inside me. Not fear, awareness. I'd interrogated people before, liars, thieves, men who thought they were smarter than the room they were standing in. This wasn't that. This man wasn't trying to get away with something. He was comfortable. Worse than that, he was in control. "You can come in," he said, "or you can stand there pretending you still have the upper hand. Either way, the conversation ends the same." I stepped inside. The door closed behind me with a soft, deliberate click that sounded louder than it should have. He walked past me without a word and sat down on the edge of a kitchen counter, arms crossed, studying me like I was the one who had shown up uninvited. I stayed standing. "How long?" I asked. He smiled again, smaller this time. "That's not the right question." I felt irritation flare, sharp and sudden. "Answer it." He tilted his head, considering. Long enough that knocking on my door was inevitable. I took a breath. "I want this to end." He laughed, not cruelly, not mockingly, almost kindly. "You're behind," he said. "It already has. You just weren't informed." The room felt tighter. I noticed details I hadn't before. The absence of photos, the lack of personal clutter, the way everything seemed staged, temporary. Like someone who never intended to stay long anywhere. Someone always preparing for the next move. "You think this is about you and me. Two men, one woman, ugly but simple." He shook his head. "That's why you're here instead of a lawyer's office." My jaw tightened. "Don't say her name." He replied smoothly. "I didn't. You did. In your head." I realized then that he wasn't improvising. This conversation had been mapped out. Maybe not word for word, but structurally. He knew where I'd start, he knew which questions I'd ask, and more unsettling than anything else, he knew what I didn't know yet. "You should go," he said, standing up. "Not because I'm afraid of you, because tonight is the last moment you get to walk away without understanding how much you've already lost." I stared at him, searching for the line where confidence becomes bluff. I didn't find it. "What did you just say?" He opened the door and held it for me. "You knocked," he said quietly. "That was your move. Everything after this is mine." I stepped back into the hallway without another word. The door closed. This time it didn't click softly. It locked. As I stood there alone, the cold finally arrived. Not in my hands, not in my chest, but somewhere deeper. The part of me that recognized patterns. The part that knew one thing with absolute clarity. This wasn't an affair. This was a setup. I didn't go straight home. I walked down the stairs, past the lobby, out into the night air, and kept walking until the building was 2 blocks behind me. My phone buzzed once in my pocket. I didn't check it. Whatever was on that screen didn't matter anymore. What mattered was replaying his voice in my head. The way he spoke like the outcome had already been agreed on by everyone except me. You're behind. Everything after this is mine. That wasn't trash talk. It was positioning. By the time I got to my car, the initial shock had burned off, leaving something sharper underneath. Focus. I sat there with the engine off, hands on the steering wheel, forcing myself not to react emotionally to what felt personal. I'd made that mistake before in my life, and every time it had cost me more than it should have. Tonight wasn't about dignity or pride. It was about information. When I finally drove home, the house was dark, except for the kitchen light. She was still up. Of course she was. I could already picture her posture at the table, phone face down, pretending to read something while listening for the sound of my keys. I paused before going inside, took one more breath, and reminded myself of one rule. Act normal, no matter how unnatural it feels. She looked up when I walked in, smiled. The same practiced expression I'd seen 1,000 times before. "You're late," she said lightly. "Traffic," I replied. The lie slid out easily, too easily. She nodded, accepting it without curiosity. That alone told me more than any confession would have. People who feel guilty don't ask questions when the answers might expose them. She stood, crossed the room, and kissed my cheek. Her hand lingered on my arm half a second too long, like she was checking something. My temperature, my tension, my awareness. I watched her walk away and understood something I hadn't allowed myself to consider until that moment. She knew I'd gone to see him. Not in detail, not with certainty, but she'd been waiting for something to change, for a crack, for confirmation that the clock had started ticking. And now it had. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay there listening to her breathing, steady and calm, while my mind pulled the conversation apart piece by piece. He hadn't threatened me. He hadn't bragged. He'd done something far more dangerous. He'd framed the situation as inevitable, like I was already reacting to a decision made long before I knocked on his door. The next morning, I did nothing. That was intentional. I went to work, answered emails, sat through meetings, smiled at people who had no idea my entire personal life had shifted on its axis overnight. From the outside, nothing was wrong. From the inside, I was cataloging every detail I'd ignored over the past few months. Late nights, vague explanations, money conversations she used to engage in, now deflected, decisions made without looping me in. That afternoon, I checked our accounts for the first time in a long while. I didn't know what I was looking for yet. I just knew I needed to start somewhere. At first glance, everything looked fine. Balances where they should be, no obvious red flags. But then I noticed the timing, transfers that didn't align with our usual patterns, withdrawals just under amounts that would trigger alerts, movement designed not to be invisible but to feel boring. That's when his words came back to me. "You're here instead of a lawyer's office." I closed my laptop and leaned back, letting the implications settle. This wasn't just about betrayal. It was about preparation, about someone assuming I would react emotionally, confront recklessly, and hand them leverage without realizing it. Someone betting on my outrage to do their work for them. That evening, I ran into something I hadn't expected. A calendar reminder she'd forgotten to delete. A meeting that didn't match the story she told me. Same time, same place. Repeating. My stomach tightened, not because of what it implied, but because of what it confirmed. This wasn't spontaneous. This was scheduled. I thought about going back to his apartment, thought about calling him, thought about forcing clarity through confrontation. And then I remembered the look on his face when he said I was early. Early for what? By midnight, I had my answer. Not fully formed, but clear enough to guide my next step. If I confronted again, I'd lose. If I accused, I'd expose myself. The only way forward was silence, observation, letting them believe I was still exactly who they thought I was. Predictable, emotional, cornered. I turned off the light and lay back down beside her, staring into the dark, already doing something they didn't expect. Nothing. The hardest part wasn't pretending nothing was wrong, it was realizing how good I was at it. Days passed, then a week. I became the version of myself they expected. Routine, predictable, emotionally muted. I asked how her day was. I nodded at the answers. I didn't press. I didn't accuse. I didn't change my schedule or my tone. If anything, I softened. Less tension, fewer questions. I watched the relief settle into her body like a drug taking effect. That relief told me more than anger ever could. I started paying attention to small things, not dramatic clues, structural ones. The way conversations redirected when money came up, how she used vague language around future plans. We'll see, we can figure it out later, let's not rush anything. It sounded reasonable. It was designed to stall. Every delay bought someone time. At night, when she slept, I checked what she thought I never would. Old emails, shared clout folders, archived threads. Not searching for proof of the affair, that was the least interesting part now, but for alignment, patterns, overlap. I wasn't looking for romance, I was looking for coordination. I found it in places most people wouldn't think to clean. A draft email never sent, saved automatically. Half a sentence referencing, once everything's finalized. No subject line, no recipient, just intent. Calendar edits made and undone. Documents renamed twice, like someone had reconsidered how obvious they should be. Each discovery alone meant nothing. Together, they told a story. Someone was planning an exit, and they weren't planning it alone. I thought about his apartment again, the absence of personal history, the way nothing there looked permanent. That wasn't coincidence, that was mobility. A man who didn't anchor himself because he didn't intend to stay where he landed. Someone used to moving through lives, not building one. The second meeting happened by accident. At least that's what it looked like on the surface. I was leaving a coffee shop near my office when I saw him across the street, talking on his phone, smiling like the world bent easily around him. He spotted me a second later. His smile didn't fade, it sharpened. He ended the call, crossed the street, and stopped a few feet away, respecting a boundary I hadn't set. "Didn't think you were a latte guy," he said. "Didn't think you worked this side of town," I replied. He shrugged. "I go where it makes sense." We stood there for a moment, traffic passing between sentences neither of us wanted to say outright. Then he leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. Not conspiratorial, just private. "You've been quiet," he said. "That's smart." I didn't respond. He studied my face, searching for something. Panic, rage, a tell. When he didn't find it, something flickered. Not fear, curiosity. "She doing okay?" he asked casually. That's when I understood the real game. He wasn't checking on her, he was checking on me, measuring whether I was destabilizing the plan, whether I'd gone off script. Silence hadn't just protected me, it had unsettled him. "She's fine," I said. "Why wouldn't she be?" He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes this time. Just making conversation. We said goodbye without shaking hands. As he walked away, I noticed something he'd missed. His phone screen lit up briefly as he pocketed it. A notification banner flashed. A familiar name. That was enough. That night, I stopped observing and started organizing. I didn't rush, I didn't confront, I documented. Dates, amounts, conversations reconstructed from fragments. I treated my own life like a case file, separating emotion from structure. By the end of the week, I had something solid. Not a full picture yet, but a direction. They thought I was behind. What they didn't realize was that while they were planning the ending, I had finally understood the beginning. And once you see where something starts, you can decide where it stops. I closed my laptop, turned off the light, and lay down beside her again. She shifted in her sleep, murmuring something unintelligible, unaware that the balance had already begun to change. Not loudly, not dramatically, just enough. I stopped looking for secrets and started watching behavior. That shift mattered. Secrets are easy to hide if you know where people usually look. Behavior is harder. It leaks through timing, tone, and repetition. It shows up in decisions that don't need to be made yet but are made anyway. It shows up in urgency disguised as patience. She began cleaning things that didn't need cleaning: old folders, old drawers, digital and physical, not aggressively, carefully, as if she was curating a version of the past she might need someone else to believe later. I didn't interrupt. I didn't ask what she was throwing away. I memorized what disappeared. The finances confirmed what I already suspected. Not theft, not recklessness, repositioning. Money moved in ways that favored flexibility over growth. Accounts consolidated, commitments softened. Anything long-term was quietly loosened. It looked responsible. It was defensive. One night, she mentioned selling the house, casually, as an idea. Not now. Someday. I nodded, asked one neutral question, and let it go. Her shoulders relaxed instantly. She thought she'd planted a seed. She didn't realize she'd exposed a timeline. He resurfaced through someone else. A mutual acquaintance mentioned him in passing, tied to a project I'd never heard about. Something short-term, consulting. No fixed address, no public footprint. The kind of work that leaves options open and questions unanswered. I smiled, feigned disinterest, and later wrote his name at the top of a page I hadn't labeled yet. I began running scenarios, not emotionally, but mechanically. What happens if I confront now? What happens if I wait? What benefits them? What benefits me? Every path that involved a reaction favored them. Every path that involved restraint shifted weight in my direction. So I waited. They grew bolder, not dramatically, confident people rarely are, but sloppy in subtle ways. Overlapping excuses, overconfidence in what I wouldn't check. A tone that assumed I was still operating inside the version of reality they'd built for me. That was their mistake. The trap wasn't something I set outwardly. It was something I allowed internally. I let them continue believing I was passive. I let them move forward. I let them make commitments that required me to stay ignorant. By the time she finally asked me, carefully, whether I trusted her, the answer was already irrelevant. Yes, I said, and I meant it in a way she couldn't hear. Because trust, I'd learned, isn't about belief. It's about letting people reveal how far they're willing to go when they think you're not watching. And they were going very far. I let them think the window was closing. Pressure does strange things to people who believe they're in control. It makes them rush steps they should space out. It makes them confirm assumptions instead of testing them. I didn't create urgency out loud. I simply stopped buffering it for them. I asked about long-term plans again, about retirement, about consolidating assets someday. Neutral questions framed as curiosity, not suspicion. Each one landed exactly where I wanted. She responded faster than before, more prepared. Answers rehearsed just a little too clean. He reappeared on cue. This time it wasn't accidental. He texted me. No preamble, no apology. We should talk, man to man. I stared at the message for a full minute before replying. Sure. We met in a public place, loud enough to discourage scenes, quiet enough for intent. He arrived early, already seated, already comfortable. Same posture, same confidence, different eyes. He'd been thinking too. You've been handling this better than most men would, he said after the initial pleasantries. Compliment disguised as assessment. I don't like wasting energy, I replied. He nodded slowly. That's good, because what's coming requires clarity. There it was. Not a threat, a framing. He talked in abstractions, futures, alignment, people growing apart. He spoke like someone explaining market forces, not human decisions. When he mentioned her, it was with ownership, disguised as concern. When he mentioned me, it was as an obstacle, already priced into the model. You're not being pushed out, he said. You're being transitioned. I didn't interrupt. He leaned forward. You can fight it. Lawyers, mess, expense. Or you can exit clean, preserve your dignity, keep what matters. Everyone walks away intact. I looked at him then, really looked, at the certainty, at the assumption that pain could be minimized by efficiency, at the belief that I would accept terms simply because they were delivered calmly. You've thought this through, I said. Of course, that's why I'm here instead of her. I nodded once. I need time. He smiled. Relief, thin but real. Take it, but not too much. When I got home, she was unusually attentive. Questions, eye contact. A dinner she hadn't planned but insisted on finishing. They'd coordinated, I could see it now clearly. Divide and manage. Pressure from both sides. Different tones, same objective. That night, while she slept, I finished organizing everything. Every transfer, every inconsistency, every assumption they'd made about my ignorance. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger would have made this messy. What I felt was precision. They thought they were negotiating my exit. What they didn't realize was that by involving me directly, they'd crossed from private betrayal into documented intent. They'd created witnesses, timelines, contradictions. By the end of the week, I had leverage they didn't know existed. I replied to its last message with one word: okay. And for the first time since this began, I slept without staring at the ceiling. I agreed to everything they suggested, just not in the way they thought. The next meeting happened in an office that didn't belong to any of us. Neutral ground, glass walls, polite smiles. The kind of place where people say, this is just a formality, while quietly sharpening knives. She sat beside him this time, angled slightly toward him without realizing it. A physical tell, alignment without words. They laid it out calmly. Timelines, options, language engineered to sound fair. No raised voices, no accusations. They wanted my consent more than my signature. Consent meant fewer variables. I asked questions, not defensive ones, clarifying ones. I repeated their phrasing back to them, watching their faces for micro adjustments. Every time they nodded, they confirmed something they hadn't intended to put on record. At one point, he spoke for her, corrected her, finished the sentence she hadn't struggled with. She didn't object. That mattered. I just want to understand, I said, when this stopped being about us and started being about strategy. Silence. Brief. Managed. He answered, that's not a useful distinction. It was the most honest thing he'd said yet. I told them I needed everything in writing, not because I didn't trust them, but because I wanted to avoid misunderstandings. He liked that. People like him always do. They believe documentation protects the confident. By the time I left, I had more than I came for. Not documents yet, but commitments, spoken expectations, a shared version of events they believed I now accepted. That night, I made one call. Not to a lawyer, not yet. To someone who understood systems. Someone who knew how quiet collapses begin. I didn't explain everything. I didn't need to. I asked one question. If two people believe a third person is uninformed, how much does that shape what they're willing to admit? The answer came quickly. Everything. The following days were almost peaceful. She relaxed into certainty. He grew careless with timing. Messages overlapped. Assumptions piled up. They believed the conflict phase was over. They were wrong. The shift happened when I stopped responding immediately. Nothing dramatic, just slower, less availability. They interpreted it as acceptance settling in. Grief, maybe. Processing. That's what they wanted to see. What they didn't see was me closing doors quietly behind them. By the time the paperwork arrived, I was ready. I read it once, then again. Then I smiled, because buried in their confidence was the final mistake. And once a mistake is documented, it stops being a risk. It becomes leverage. The collapse didn't start with an argument. It started with a pause. I didn't sign anything right away. I thanked them for putting everything together, said I wanted a few days to review it properly. He agreed too quickly. She avoided my eyes. They both believed the same thing. I was delaying out of weakness, not calculation. Those few days were enough. I forwarded the documents to the right people. Not with accusations, just questions, neutral ones. Questions that forced timelines to be compared and assumptions to be checked against records. The kind of questions that don't sound dangerous until they're answered. Then I waited. The first crack appeared when she came home earlier than expected one evening. phone already in her hand, face tight in a way she couldn't smooth over fast enough. "Have you talked to anyone?" she asked. "About what?" I replied. She hesitated, just long enough. He called me an hour later. No greeting this time, no confidence in his voice. "Who have you been speaking to?" "Why?" I asked. "Because things are getting complicated." That word again, complicated. The refuge of people losing control. By the end of the week, the version of reality they'd built together couldn't hold its shape anymore. Dates didn't line up. Statements contradicted earlier assurances. What they thought were private understandings now existed in multiple inboxes, compared side by people who had no emotional stake in protecting either of them. She cried when it finally broke. Not loudly, not dramatically. Quiet, controlled tears meant to reframe the situation as emotional rather than strategic. I let her cry. I didn't comfort her. I didn't accuse her either. I just asked one question. "When were you going to tell me the truth?" She didn't answer. She couldn't. Any answer would have collapsed the last defense she had left. He didn't apologize. He tried to negotiate. That told me everything. By the time they realized the narrative had flipped, it was too late to correct it. What they thought was a clean transition was now a documented pattern. What they believed was leverage was now liability. They'd planned my exit carefully. What they hadn't planned for was me staying just long enough to decide how the story would be told. Everything they touched started to unravel at once, and all I did was stop protecting them from the consequences of their own confidence. The final conversation didn't happen in a courtroom or an office. It happened at home, late, when there was nowhere left to redirect the truth. She sat across from me at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug she hadn't touched. The house felt different now, quieter, not peaceful, emptied. The kind of quiet that comes after something irreversible has already happened. He was no longer part of the discussion. Whatever influence he thought he had evaporated the moment other people started asking questions he couldn't answer cleanly. His calls had stopped. His confidence withered into silence. Men like him don't fight when the terrain changes. They disappear and look for somewhere softer to land. She didn't. "I never meant for it to go this far," she said. I nodded. That's usually how plans fail. She looked up then, finally meeting my eyes, searching for anger, for accusation, for anything that would let her position herself as a victim of the motion instead of a participant in design. She didn't find it. "You are supposed to react," she said quietly. I did, just not the way you expected. That was the moment she understood. Not the money, not the documents, not the consequences, the miscalculation. She'd measured my value by how loudly I could be provoked. She'd never considered how dangerous quiet could be. There was nothing left to say after that. No dramatic exit, no speech. We moved through the final steps with efficiency and distance, exactly the way they'd planned for me. Only now, every outcome favored reality instead of assumption. Weeks later, I passed his building again. Different car out front. Different name on the intercom. Temporary, as always. I didn't stop. Revenge, I learned, doesn't require destruction. It requires accuracy, letting people follow their own logic to its natural end, then stepping aside when it collapses. I knocked on his door once, thinking I was confronting a man. What I found instead was a system. And once you see the system, you don't need to fight it. You just let it fail.